Hello and welcome to the NEWSPASTE Podcast with me, Johnny Vedmore, your host, and I'm here with someone very special, Mr. Richard Poe, describes himself as a New York Times best-selling author, probably because he is, a journalist with a rather complex ancestry. His works include Perfect Fear, Four Tales of Terror, which sounds interesting and apparently has an abundance of blood, and then Hillary's Secret War, and The Shadow Party, which was the New York Times bestseller. And he co-wrote with David Horowitz, who has written a load of very interesting works, and of course looks in the same sort of areas as Mr. Poe and myself. So without any further ado, we're going to talk today about some things in history which have been forgotten in time. A new history is formed, and we're going to have to get right down at the beginning. So to get this out of the way, who is Richard Poe? Mr. Poe, where did you come from? Welcome on the NEWSPASTE Podcast. Where did you come from, and what was your background?
Well, thanks, Johnny, for having me here. I've been a professional writer, journalist, just about my whole adult life. Got my first newspaper job at age 25, and I've worked for various newspapers, magazines. I was at one point managing editor of the East Village Eye in New York City, reporter for the New York Post. I was a senior editor for Success magazine, and so forth and so on. So I came up through a pretty conventional print journalism route. And for some time, I was a full-time author for quite a number of years and doing very well at that until my publisher was acquired by a gigantic multi-billion-dollar publishing corporation. Well, I've been in the think tank world a little bit. I worked for David Horowitz a number of years and doing think tank sort of research. And some of that research that I did with Mr. Horowitz led to the book you mentioned, The Shadow Party. And that book was a real turning point in my life. It became a very well-known book. It was a New York Times bestseller, but more importantly, it was featured on the Glenn Beck show back in 2010, 2011. In a very famous series that Beck called The Puppet Master, all exposing George Soros. And that's kind of what I became known for. And let's just say it was a life-changing turn in my life. It basically ended, it ended my career as a mainstream journalist, acceptable in the, let's say, the neocon world, from, you could say, from whence I sprang, although I never really was a neocon, but somehow I was a sort of species that managed to swim in that habitat. And but things changed quite definitely after I became known as a person who was writing very persistently about Soros, because you see, the Shadow Party was simply the latest in a series of things I'd done about Soros. I had previously written a cover story about him in Newsmax magazine back in 2004, and I was on the O'Reilly Factor talking about that, and instantly became a target of the Soros-funded attack group, Media Matters for America. And then even prior to that, I had written about Soros way back in 1993 in a book. It was actually a sort of how-to book. It was called How to Profit from the Coming Russian Boom. And when I was at Success magazine, they had sent me to Russia several times to report on the fall of communism and the reinstitution of quote-unquote capitalism. And so I wrote this book. It was very positive. I was at the time very enthused about what was happening in Russia. I was partly because of my age group, I suppose. I'm a baby boomer, and I was very much imbued with the Cold War ideology. And when the Iron Curtain came down, I believed somehow the West had won, the forces of goodness and righteousness had somehow won some great struggle against darkness. And so that was all reflected in my book. And I wrote very positively about Mr. Soros as being one of the people who was on our team, whoever we actually are.
A misty, non-governmental octopus-aligned neocon sort of wave. I think it is. I think that's what they were especially in the fight against Soviet, like the fall of Soviet Empire.
Right. And so I wrote about him totally in that regard. But then later on, and I will say I was aware even at the time that there were some controversies surrounding Mr. Soros, but I ignored them. The first thing I wrote about him was quite positive. And although he turned down my request to interview him personally, he did very kindly allow me to interview some of his personnel who were on the ground in Russia, and I wrote favorably about many of his operations there. So I did have some hope that actually that me and Mr. Soros could get off on the right foot at that point back in '93. But I think he didn't like my book. He never said so. But just I think it was 3 years later, in 1996, I believe, the Free Press came out with a book which I have to describe as a substitute for my book. It had a very similar color design. My book was called How to Profit from the Coming Russian Boom, and this substitute book was called The Coming Russian Boom. And not only that, but Mr. Soros himself gave it a glowing endorsement on the back cover, which he had not done for mine. Not that there's any reason he should have, but I did notice that. And then a known Soros operative wrote a review of of this new book saying, "This is now the book that everybody should read about Russia. Richard Poe's book is now completely out of date."
Wow.
So I gather
a new edition of the textbooks come out for kids. I'm afraid the curriculum's changing.
Right now. So I gather from those events, and Johnny, you're a guy who connects dots just like me. I can't say I can conclusively prove that Mr. Soros was unhappy with my book, but it appears from his actions and those of some of his operatives that not only did they disapprove of my book, but they felt the need to replace it. And what's interesting about that is when my book, the How to Profit from the Coming Russian Boom, when it first came out in 1993, it was critically acclaimed. It was very well reviewed in all the right places, including the London Financial Times, which gave it a marvelous write-up and said that it was the first book which had explained the privatization process in Russia, which they were then preparing. So my theory as to what I did wrong, obviously I did something wrong, is that maybe the very thing the Financial Times liked about the book, which was clearly explaining how the privatization process worked, maybe that was part of what Mr. Soros and his friends didn't like about it, because they were all involved, as we now know, with corrupting the privatization process and co-opting it, and in some cases lining their own pockets with through the privatization of the former state-owned Soviet properties. And so maybe that was part of the reason. I also said that there was a chapter on corruption in my book in which I I told some hard truths about Mayor Lushkov of Moscow, and I was reliably informed that Mr. Lushkov took personal offense, which and actually banned my book from sale in Moscow, which didn't
hadn't
help.
quite got used. Yeah, hadn't quite got used to the new paradigm.
Right.
Banning books still.
So this was my very first published book, and so I really jumped right into the thick of things without even intending to. I had been involved with a lot of controversial political writing before. I'd gotten the FBI very mad at me and things like that. But this book, I thought, well, now I've joined the establishment. I'm on the side of the angels. I'm pro-business. I'm pro-capitalism. The U.S. Commerce Department is encouraging people to invest in Russia. How could I go wrong? I was really trying to walk the straight and narrow. I was trying to be a good boy. But it seems to be my fate in life, Johnny,
that you're a bad boy.
Yeah, it seems to be my fate that even when I'm trying to be good, I end up being bad. I don't know what to make of that. But anyway, so that's the first thing I wrote about Mr. Soros. In 2004, I got a call from Chris Ruddy at Newsmax. I was already writing for Newsmax. I was one of the part of the startup team, actually. In a sense, I was one of the earliest columnists within a year after they were founded. So Chris called me up and said he wants to do an expose of Soros. And that was because Soros had suddenly become outspoken about internal U.S. politics, a subject he had previously avoided very scrupulously. He was known simply for interfering in other countries' affairs, but he tended to avoid U.S. affairs. And suddenly he jumped in pretending he was all upset with George Bush over the war on terror, and that Bush was supposedly a tyrant who was going to destroy democracy and destroy the world. And Soros, during this time, famously gave a speech at the London School of Economics calling for the puncture of the bubble of U.S. supremacy. He openly began calling to bring down the power of the United States. And we now know that what Soros was doing was simply getting in line with what was then already an official UK policy to get behind the BRICS movement and the multipolarist movement for the very purpose of indeed bringing down the power of the United States, substituting for what is supposedly the unipolar US order, a new order which is supposedly multipolar and which is supposedly going to be better than the unipolar U.S. order being overthrown as we speak today. But this brings me to my present course of research regarding the world in general, globalism in particular, and the role of Mr. George Soros in the globalist enterprise. And please stop me at any time, by the way, Johnny, if you think I'm getting too long-winded or if you want to ask a question, because I can go on forever.
No. You keep going. You keep going. I'm enjoying listening. At the moment, I will always interrupt if needs be. I promise. I'm one of those. Don't evoke the interruptions.
Right. Well, the thing is, what I'm known for now in this incarnation of my life, beginning from about 3 years ago, I started writing about a subject which I had never written about before, even though I had been aware of it for more than 30 years. And this is the subject of the let's call it the hidden power of Great Britain and the hidden role of British elites in the whole drive towards globalism. Now, I had been reading about this from various sources. I'd say most notably Professor Carol Quigley, as well as other alternative researchers, historical revisionists of various sorts. This has been a favorite subject of, let's call them conspiracy theorists, going way back. The topic of how all the evil in the world allegedly originates in London. And there are two schools of thought on why it originates in London. One is the school of thought, which seems to be quite prevalent now on Twitter, which is that the Jews allegedly control the world, most particularly the Rothschild dynasty, with its seat of power in the city of London. This theory, it seems to have gained a tremendous amount of traction on Twitter, on X.
I think it's very meme friendly. Everybody knows the routine, and you can stick the name down there. You can stick a Rothschild name down there. Everybody's so it works really well. I think that's one of the reasons why it catches on, because just everybody knows that.
Yes, and we can talk later about why everybody knows it. That's one of my theories.
Well, they've been in some extremely important moments in history, especially as we see in Israel-Hamas war going off. We know that there is signatures from Rothschilds that are really important in the history of the world.
Right, and so in any case, as I was saying, there are two ways of looking at this idea that all roads lead to London. This particular branch of what we could call conspiracy theory. So the one theory is basically that the Rothschilds rule England, have always ruled the British Empire, and that every evil of the alleged against the British Empire was really perpetrated by the Rothschilds. That's one theory. The other theory, I think, is actually a little kinder to the great British people, in saying that they themselves may be guilty of some of their own deeds. And I think that's actually more of a compliment to them, instead of thinking that they're just so stupid that they're capable only of being led around by the nose by the Rothschilds. But this is the second theory, in other words, is that the British themselves are the British. They're not controlled by anybody else, but the British crown, the British monarchy, the British aristocracy, and the British establishment and elites in general are in charge of all of these globalist enterprises which have come out of England, and that we should start there. And if there are certain banking dynasties who help them do it, well, that's another question. But I'm definitely in the second category. I tend to think that things that the British do are actually done by the British and not being done by Rothschild puppet masters necessarily. And the fact that I believe that has gotten me some criticism on X. There are some people who are very annoyed that I take that position, and the fact that I am partially of Jewish ancestry myself has been raised as a possible reason why I'm supposedly covering for the Rothschilds. My father was Jewish. My late father, he was of Russian Jewish descent. My mother was actually of partially Jewish descent as well on her Mexican side, but she was part Mexican and part Korean, North Korean as it happens. So as you mentioned, I have quite a mixed background. But and I was raised as a Catholic, by the way. I am Catholic by faith, or at least culturally Catholic. I'm afraid I just posted something about the Pope this morning.
Yeah, I saw.
So I don't let my ethnicity or my religious affiliations interfere with my investigative agendas. But anyway, just to mention that in passing, I will say this actually, since we're on the subject. I first discovered this theory of the Rothschilds ruling the world more than 30 years ago. And I read it in a book by a guy named Eustace Mullins. And the book was called The World Order. And it basically took the position that the Rothschilds are the head of the snake, and they rule the world from their offices in the city of London. And I bought it when I read that. I'm not going to say I believed it naively in every detail, but I was excited about it in the sense that I felt I discovered something that was very illuminating. And I went right to my parents, to my mother and father, and I was telling them, oh, I just read this book about the Rothschilds, and it says this and that and the other. And my father, my Jewish father, was a little concerned, and he apparently knew something about Eustace Mullins, and he in his very gentle way cautioned me that I should take that Mullins was an anti-Semitic writer, as indeed he is, and I should take this with a grain of salt. And because I loved and respected my father very much, I took his advice. I didn't take his advice on everything, unfortunately, in my life, but on this I did. And I took a step back and I re-examined this idea of the Rothschilds being the head of the snake. And I basically came to the conclusion that they were not the head of the snake. And I still have that position today. But it's very important, Johnny, as you know, when you're doing this kind of really deep research, when you're really questioning fundamental aspects of the received history, the received wisdom that we get in school and through the mass media, it's very important to have an open mind. And having an open mind means being able to read completely without prejudice, to read people from the most extreme ends of the spectrum, whether from the extreme left to the extreme right and everything in between, and to be able to try on different points of view. Mm-hmm. By trying them on, it doesn't mean believing in them, but it simply means saying, okay, suppose this is true, then what? Mm-hmm. So there was a time not too long ago in my career when I would never even want to admit ever having read a book by Eustace Mullins, because he's known as a fascist and an anti-Semite. And I have read books by people like him and publications and people way over on the extreme left as well. And I have learned valuable things from all of them.
Oh, yeah.
And
you learn why people are angry is one of the things. You learn why people are angry.
Yes, exactly. What is their beef?
Mm-hmm.
What is their beef? And so I think it's really, really important, if you look at things from only an ideologically driven viewpoint, you will not understand why many large portions of the population are angry. You won't know what they're angry about. You'll know what some people are angry about, but not others. And as you just said, Johnny, knowing what people are angry about is essential to trying to figure out how we in this world are being oppressed, how we are being cheated, how we are being robbed, because it's not just being done by some particular group which is ideologically driven. Now, who is doing it? Well, to return to my narrative, I started out in a way looking at George Soros for some reason. And I guess the reason is because I was very interested in Russia. I had studied Russian in school. I had gone to school briefly in Leningrad back in 1978 when I was in college. So I was very interested in the Russian language, in the Russian culture, the Russian history, and the Soviet Union, partly because of my family connection to that part of the world, partly because I came of age during the Cold War. But for whatever reason, I didn't follow the path that so many of my classmates did at the University of Leningrad. You know, I went there with a big group of Americans, many of whom were there because they were preparing to go into the national security establishment. I didn't do that. I actually had a very impractical and, in hindsight, very unrealistically romantic view that I was going to be a pure writer and a pure journalist of the underground sort, and I was going to speak truth to power and all that, all of which now seems ludicrous to me because I now know what I guess most of us have learned in this cynical age of ours, that George Orwell was right. There is no underground. There is no resistance that has not been thoroughly penetrated and manipulated by the state. And of course, Orwell's character, Winston Smith, learned this the hard way in the novel 1984, when he attempted to join the underground and found it was being run by the thought police. And so I think that's how things really run in this world. And yet somehow, even knowing that, and even realizing that whichever way we turn, we're going to run into that Orwellian reality of controlled opposition and fake heroes, fake champions of the oppressed, and so forth and so on. Nonetheless, there is a way to swim in this particular sea, and I'm still trying to do it. So basically where this has all led me now, at this point in my life, is going back to the strange figure of George Soros and realizing that he works for the British. This is an idea that I encountered decades ago in many writings by various alternative researchers. It's not something I discovered myself, but I didn't have proof of it, and I wasn't quite sure. I wasn't 100% that it was true. So that even when I wrote The Shadow Party with David Horowitz, and that was published back in 2006, I didn't go near that issue. And I'll tell you, Johnny, that I knew enough when I co-wrote that book with Mr. Horowitz. I was really quite certain at that point that George Soros was working for the British, but I didn't dare to say it. I wasn't afraid to go after Soros, and that can get you in a lot of trouble, and it did me. I was not afraid to go after Soros, but I was afraid to go after the British. And this is something a lot of people don't understand, because when you go after the Brits, when you go after this, let's call it a secret, the secret of British influence, of how the US-UK special relationship actually works. And what I mean by the secret is, I mean that basically that the UK holds the upper hand and that the UK is calling the shots, and the UK is the senior partner, not the US. And this is what I will attempt to prove in the course of this interview. Once you start getting into that subject, you will find that this is a closely guarded secret, and you will be resisted in all kinds of strange ways. And so, and I knew this when I wrote The Shadow Party, and so I avoided that subject. Moreover, I wasn't going to even propose that to my co-author, David. I mean, he didn't even want to go after the CIA in that book, and rightly so, wisely so at that particular juncture back in that environment of 2006. He was right and about that at that time and in that place and for that particular purpose. But I was, I was very reckless. I was young. I was full of fight. But the fact is that the point is that I want to make is that I was already aware of Soros's strange connections with British intelligence and the British establishment in general. But even I, reckless I, didn't dare to go there at that point. So at that time, the myth was being put out. The cover story for Soros, which was put forth very clearly in a New Yorker article in 1995 by a woman named Bruck. I can't remember her first name. Connie Bruck. Brilliant article. She should have gotten a book deal for that. Strangely, she didn't. It was one of the earliest and most important exposés of Soros. And she quoted some very high-level people in the U.S. national security establishment, the State Department, basically saying, that Soros is a force unto himself. We treat him, we, meaning the U.S. establishment, supposedly treat Soros as a sovereign government, as a friendly but independent sovereign government, a stateless statesman who represents nobody, not the U.S., not anybody. And so they told this to Connie Bruck with a straight face, and this was the myth of him, that he was some kind of James Bond villain who was so rich, so powerful, so wily and cunning that not even the mighty United States of America could rein him in. He was all on his own. And what was he doing with this extraordinary power of his? He was actually going all over the world, overthrowing governments by sponsoring and financing color revolutions, including such important governments as the Gorbachev regime in the Soviet Union. And I have written in The Shadow Party and in some of my online writings about how and why George Soros was personally involved in toppling Gorbachev. And so we've been asked to believe that this man, George Soros, this stateless statesman, so-called, was going around the world overthrowing governments, including the last Communist Party government of the USSR, and he was doing this all on his own, for his own reasons, like some James Bond villain, literally.
Oh, there's some. I gotta just say that I'm currently I'm in the last stages of an article, drafting an article out about some MI6 operatives, very famous ones linked to Sergei Skripal, and one of them is standing in 1993 watching Yeltsin on top of a tank outside the Russian White House, giving his speech, rallying the troops just before the coup's happening, and this is like one of the big members of MI6 watching on as it's all going on, and that's something I see repeated throughout history. Keep what you were about to say there. There's a couple of things that I should say. In my Schwab research, a lot of people just wanted me to go into the Rothschilds. Really, they wanted Schwab to be related to the Rothschilds, so they found two Schwab, a Schwab couple that were related to a Rothschild family, and loads of people just said, "This is it." There was this very it went round. It was a viral TikTok of a girl going on about, look, Klaus Schwab is a Rothschild because these people who are Schwab are Rothschilds. And it was not his parents, of course, or his grandparents or his line. It was a different line because these people who married, the Schwabs who married into the Rothschilds were up in the north, but it catches on really well. And when I look at, I kind of, from a British perspective, have studied from about 1400s and onwards. And what I think the reason why the British are so powerful in the way that you speak and in every nook and every cranny and have like top-down control, quite simply because they've been doing it for such a long time that they built the whole system in the first place to mean that it's just like strong pillars that will last for ages and ages. And even when the colonies started to fall, those pillars stayed strong with the use of intelligence and other methods where they were well ahead and manipulating America while being a partner and allied to America during all that period. And I feel that the Rothschilds have been so important because some of the Rothschilds have been accepted in to that British establishment in a way that means they are there next to the center of power. But sorry, continue on. You were.
Well, I completely agree, Johnny. The way you described it is exactly the way I see it. And how Soros fits into this, it becomes very clear when you look back at his life story. First of all, he arrived in Great Britain as a very young man. I think he was 17. He came as a refugee from his native Hungary, and he lived in the UK for about 10 years. And during that time, he graduated from the London School of Economics, and he got his start as a financier in the City of London. And I believe that it was during that time, after his graduation from the London School of Economics and before he left for the US in 1956, I believe it was during that time that he was actually recruited by a cabal of financiers, people at the very highest level of the British establishment in the City of London. And I have documented his relationship with these individuals at a later date. I cannot yet prove that he made contact with them prior to going to the US, but that's my hypothesis. That's my working hypothesis, and I've seen it claimed by other people, but without giving their sources. So, but I'm pretty sure that that's what happened, because that's normally how people are recruited anyway. They're recruited out of school or shortly after they leave school. But there's no question that Soros was recruited and had to be recruited. If he wasn't recruited by British intelligence, he would have had to be recruited by US intelligence or some other intelligence agency. And this is the real issue, that because of the activities in which he was engaged, which were basically regime change operations, color revolutions, and economic warfare, actually destabilizing sovereign nations by attacking their sovereign currencies. These types of activities are forms of warfare, and they're covert operations, and they're methods of warfare. And a private citizen, no matter how wealthy or influential, is simply not allowed to take place in these activities unless they are under the control and supervision of an intelligence agency, period.
Mhm.
This is the overwhelming and obvious fact about Mr. Soros and a whole lot of other people like him. To suggest that he's somehow a loose cannon and doing this on his own, it's literally like saying that somebody could open up let's say a heroin shop in the middle of Brooklyn, let's say, and start selling heroin and just do it on his own without expecting to get a knock on the door from the drug cartels and somebody informing him, you're going to work for us and you're going to give us our cut or we're going to kill you. I mean, that's how drug cartels work. That's how all businesses work, quite frankly. Nobody can just, when you have a vested interest with lots of money being made, nobody just lets you walk in off the street and start cutting into their market share and start affecting their business. They don't do that. And they especially don't do that in the world of intelligence, where governments are being overthrown and currencies are being destabilized. It's
And it's
just not
also,
allowed.
I mean, what you were saying there about needing someone was going to recruit him, so he needed to be recruited. There's a very small pool of people who have these sort of skills and abilities that are and who are noticeable to these recruiters, that they're fighting over them, and then they're the ones who are deciding. It's a very small, closed network of people who are deciding how the whole game like this is run as well.
Yes, exactly. And so the fact that Soros attended school in the UK made him an automatic target for recruitment. This is an officially and publicly admitted policy of the UK Foreign Office. They say that they do this, they brag about it. They came out with a white paper, I think in 2015, where the UK boasted that it was the #1 soft power in the world, and specifically because it had this program of recruiting people, of bringing foreign students into the UK university systems, students such as Soros, recruiting them and then keeping track of them throughout their lives, so that if they rose to prominence and started doing important things, they would be approached and they would be recruited and they would be made to act as agents for British interests. So the UK Foreign Office boasts that they are the world's leaders in this particular activity of recruiting foreign students to come to their universities and then recruiting them into the service of British statecraft and intelligence. So the mere fact that Soros went to the London School of Economics made him an automatic target of such recruitment. But then there is other evidence showing that it was actually done. And I wrote an article about this a couple of years ago called How the British Invented George Soros. And there I showed that Soros, what really created the phenomenon of Soros as we know him, the idea that he's some kind of extraordinary financial genius, the idea that he's a lone wolf who acts on his own, the idea that he broke the Bank of England, quote unquote, back in 1992. All of these elements of the Soros myth, I learned, were basically constructions, propaganda constructions that were put together primarily and apparently under the supervision of one Lord William Rees-Mogg. And you may know who he is. He was the father of Jacob Rees-Mogg. Lord William Rees-Mogg died in 2012, I think. And he was
establishment through and through.
Well, yes, sure. Among other things. I call him the man who invented George Soros. He, from his perch at the Times of London, essentially created with his own hands, through his own columns, virtually everything we believe about George Soros today. all the nonsense specifically that we believe about him being a lone wolf and all that. He was none of those things. And what Rees-Mogg did was, so in 1992, basically what happened is there was a financial operation, a run on the pound that basically resulted in a 20% devaluation of the British pound. This operation was supposedly spearheaded and led by Soros, a fact which has never been proved. But as a result of this operation, and as a result of the 20% devaluation of the pound, the British sterling was kicked out of the European exchange rate mechanism. It was disqualified, and as a result, it was no longer qualified to be converted to the euro, which supposedly the British establishment had wanted it to be. So this was a huge crisis and was played up as such in the British press. But strangely, Lord William Rees-Mogg and some people close to him were celebrating it as a great triumph of their position, because they never wanted to enter the Eurozone. And so for a few weeks, nobody knew how this had happened. Nobody knew who did it. And then all of a sudden, Soros himself stepped forward and identified himself and said, I did it, which in the world of this kind of shady financial activity is totally unheard of, unknown. Nobody who does this kind of trading ever deliberately puts their face in front of the TV cameras, because it's dangerous. You can end up in jail or worse for doing things like playing games with sovereign currencies of important countries like the UK. It's a very dangerous game, and it's not a game that unaffiliated lone wolves are allowed to play. It's just not allowed. It's too important. So anyway, Soros stepped forward and he announced, I think it was in the Daily Mirror, and he said, I did it. And then the Times, where Lord Rees-Mogg had his perch. Rees-Mogg, of course, had been the editor-in-chief of the Times for 15 years. Then he became a governor of the BBC. He was a major, major force in British media at the time. He was also, that is Lord Rees-Mogg, the father of Jacob Rees-Mogg. He was also a very close personal friend with the royal family, and he was a very close friend of Lord Jacob Rothschild, and also a business partner of him. So he was one of the most powerful people, not only in the UK, but in the entire world. And he was a bridge. I call him a bridge between worlds, because he had one foot in the grubby world of the City of London and the Rothschild Empire, and then he had another world and another foot in Buckingham Palace, where he was apparently a very close friend of the royals. And he played that role, and it was specifically because he was able to bridge those two worlds and play that role that he was able to emerge as the official promoter of George Soros. So he came forward from his perch at the Times of London, and he and his team promoted Soros and announced that Soros, they gave him his name, the man who broke the Bank of England. That was their headline in the Times of London, and they created this whole myth that he was a financial genius who had done this all by himself and made, I think, $2 billion in the process, and had in the process had done a great service to the British people by keeping them out of the Eurozone. And So Rees-Mogg became, in effect, Soros's publicist, his unofficial publicist, singing his praises. And in very short order, within a few years, Soros was set up with his quantum fund in the Netherlands Antilles, which is the British call those secrecy jurisdictions, I think, banking havens, where you can do all kinds of shady business with a complete lack of transparency. And from his perch in the Netherlands Antilles, he was doing God knows what. But one of his investors was the Queen of England, it turned out. And she was also invested in a company called Rio Tinto, which became embroiled in all sorts of controversies in Africa and other countries, trying to corner the market in various mineral and energy resources, all of which I've written about. It's kind of off topic for now, but Rio Tinto got involved with a very ugly situation in the African country of Guinea. They got in a big fight over mineral rights there, and Soros got involved in that in a very strange way. It's hard to imagine why he would have even involved himself, but he was clearly taking the side of Rio Tinto, which again was partially owned by the royal family.
Yeah, and seems to be like the board, like people who serve on the board there, seems to be like a haven for people who are getting rewarded by the establishment. That's where you'll go sit on the board of one of these companies.
Right.
It did come up a couple of times in my investigations of like the people after their main business is done, then they go to somewhere like that and sit there and manage.
Well, I didn't realize it had quite that that it had been institutionalized to quite that extent. That's very interesting.
Yeah. I would think you would find if you would look at this is one of the things I'm very interested in. I'm doing it at the moment with embassies during the Cold War and onwards, is that if you look at these hotbeds of intelligence and establishment linked people, you just find more intelligence linked people and more establishment linked people. So you kind of like it darts you off into new investigations all of the time. So you can always find a new stone to turn over. Anyway, sorry, go on. I don't mean to interrupt.
Well, we must compare notes on that at some point because I'm extremely interested in this subject. So anyway, Soros popped up in the middle of this Rio Tinto controversy, clearly taking the side of Rio Tinto and using his influence as a UN-affiliated NGO to accuse. There was an Israeli entrepreneur named Steinmetz who was basically competing with Rio Tinto to get certain mineral rights in Guinea. And long story short, Soros intervened using all his power as a UN-approved NGO to make all sorts of false accusations against Steinmetz, get him in huge trouble, eventually get him arrested. The guy was a multi-billionaire, and his own Israeli government arrested him. And according to allegations made by Steinmetz in a certain lawsuit, he claimed that the Obama administration and President Obama personally had involved himself with Soros and with this apparently British plot to suppress Steinmetz and to basically to help Rio Tinto win its battle with Steinmetz. Anyway, that's a little off the beaten trail. I was brought up quite religious too as a Catholic, my mother's faith, but my father was Jewish. And he was quite openly disdainful of Christianity. So he imparted what I like to think was a healthy skepticism about the whole rigmarole,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
it
yeah.
was because of course you always, as a boy, you want to please your father more than
Hmm.
your mother. And how can you please your father if you're Catholic and your father is Jewish? But
By converting him. That's how you can please him.
well, I know. It's my own strange spaghetti-like journey. It is,
Yeah, we've all got a bit of that going on. Trust me, we've all got a bit of that. So you were saying that basically Soros was recruited up by the English, and a lot of his actions were in line with what the power base wanted. So what was Soros to do next then? What makes you like what helps to solidify in his actions afterwards that he's really working for the British?
well, let me say, let me admit that if you're asking me, can I quote unquote prove it beyond any doubt whatsoever, I would say no. I can only prove that he acted in concert with very high level British uh, players, such as Lord William Rees-Mogg
Mm-hmm.
and Lord Jacob Rothschild, and indeed with the royal family in terms of handling certain of their investments. I put together all the pieces of the puzzle in my article um, about Soros, and basically left the reader to decide for themselves. But the what it really comes down to is, because of the kinds of operations he was involved in, which had to do with regime change and with economic warfare at a very high level, he could not possibly have been allowed to do these things without being uh, without working in league with the Western Alliance, with NATO, and with the Five Eyes alliance. So the only question is, was he working for the American CIA, as many people allege? You'll see that alleged quite often on the internet and on social media, or was he working for somebody else? And I, in my article, excuse me, in my article, I put my bet on the possibility that he's working for the British. But did I prove it beyond the shadow of a doubt? No, I didn't. And, it's very hard to prove who somebody is working for in the world of covert operations and intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
How are you going to get that final proof? I mean,
Yeah,
they
yeah,
don't
yeah. Agreed,
go
agreed,
around.
agreed. Why
They,
do you think people like Soros and Kissinger are allowed up to such high levels? What do you think make them special? Is it just their skill set and the just being in the right place at the right time, or is there something else, do you think?
well, I think in both of those cases, well, of course, one of the things that we're all learning now that we didn't know before, by us, I mean the public, John Q. Public, we're learning that a lot of people who seem to be just your average man on the street, that they actually have family connections that we don't know about. And often those family connections are concealed by name changes and things like that. So I would guess that in the case of both Mr. Soros and uh, Henry Kissinger, I think you mentioned, in both of those cases, I suspect there is more to their family histories than we realize, and
Mm-hmm.
that a lot of who they really are in terms of their genealogies um, probably explains a lot of why the establishment took such an interest in them at such an
Yeah.
early age.
Well,
That
I can say that Kissinger, from a very young age, his mother was the kosher housemaid for Nahum Goldman, who's one of the founders of Israel, and the fathers of Zionism. So, I mean, it's likely that and of course Guido Goldman, who's his son, become Kissinger's best mate eventually. So I suppose you can also be lucky enough to have family who are aligned or have allegiance, but she wouldn't have been the kosher housemaid for the Nahum Goldman and his family unless she had been somehow accepted, probably through family line and the fact of who she was married to, etc. So you are quite right there, I think.
right, and Soros came from a very prominent family in Hungary, where he's from, and that much is known and that much is admitted. But probably there's even more to his bloodline than the standard biographies let us know. And I haven't cracked that mystery yet. But the fact is, excuse me, the fact is he was elevated to a very, very high position in the global hierarchy. And although we're led to believe it was simply because he was such a genius and he was so good at trading on the markets and all that, the fact is we don't live in a meritocracy, and simply being good at something is not a sufficient reason to allow somebody to attain that kind of level. You have to come from the right family, the right bloodline. You have to be, there are only so many places at the top at that level, and people are selected on a number of criteria. It's not a meritocracy. And now in the case of Soros especially, it looks to me as if I believe, I can't prove it, but I believe he was probably recruited right out of school. That's the normal way people are recruited. He did go to the London School of Economics, and he then got involved as a trader in the city of London. And he then went to New York in 1956. And he had a meteoric rise to becoming one of the seemingly most brilliant, most lucky, and wealthiest traders on Wall Street. And we all know his legend that, he pulled himself up by his bootstraps and so forth. But probably, as with most such stories, there were family connections behind him that were more important than we're led to believe. Now, the thing about his British connection is there's no question that Lord William Rees-Mogg was, in some sense, his handler, that Rees-Mogg endorsed him. Rees-Mogg was his publicist. He used his bully pulpit at the Times. He used his uniquely privileged position as a close friend of the British royal family and as a very close friend of Jacob Rothschild. And of course, Lord Rees-Mogg had a son whom he named Jacob. I'm guessing he named him after Jacob Rothschild. So he was a very special person. He was a bridge between worlds, I like to call him.
Be really interested to find out if he was named after Jacob Rothschild. Actually, I'll go and look into that. I'll see if I can find anything around. That'd be really
well. His father was both a very close personal friend of Jacob Rothschild and a very close business partner. So
what bigger honor than to name your son? Yeah,
right. So in any case, there's no question that Soros was adopted at the very highest levels of the British establishment in the early 90s and actually before, if you look at some of the details. But it all went public in 1992 with the so-called breaking of the Bank of England. And it was a brilliant psychological operation in the sense that even if to this day, when to this day I suggest to people that Soros is working for the British, the average person or the people who haven't studied this question deeply will say, well, he's the one who broke the Bank of England. I mean, he did a terrible disservice to this country. How could he be working for the British? But he was working for the British elites. He wasn't working for the British people. And he was serving their interests. And for them, if the average British working person or middle-class person lost 20% of his net worth as a result of this devaluation, what is that to them? Because they achieved their goal. So I think the relationship between Soros, between Lord Rees-Mogg, and between Jacob Rothschild and the whole sort of gang of City of London investors that revolves around the St. James Place Capital Group, it's very, very clear that these were the people who were behind Soros in the early 90s when all these events took place. So everything, you could say it's circumstantial evidence, but it's a whole lot of circumstantial evidence that really points to his being a British asset rather than an American one. And I think it's very significant, too, that as his career progressed, when he famously went after George Bush in the 2004 election, he didn't just go after Bush as a candidate. He went after the United States. He basically said that the U.S. had become a rogue state and had to be taken down. Mm-hmm. And so again, he became very publicly.
Do you wonder if that's like him being made into the antithesis of whatever they want to create on the other side, so that they can argue against him? Oh, look, this is this left-wing liberal rich man, and we're the ones who are coming to save you. Could there be an element of that to it?
On whose part do you mean?
Like, I mean, a lot of the time the establishment likes to create the heroes and villains. So in that case, he's a villain to the American people. It's got to, in my opinion, be for a reason that he takes that stance. It's either for his own reason, that is self-indulgent hubris, or his own connections, or maybe the British, giving a warning to the Americans via one of their many assets. But it could also be that he's playing part of a character in the game, maybe.
Well, yes, I think that absolutely. I think that's exactly what he's doing. I believe, in fact, that Soros is not so much, he's less of a financier and more of a propagandist. I think his actual role is to go before the cameras and play the part of sort of a James Bond villain. And that's where we get this whole idea that was promoted in that New Yorker article back in 1995, that he is somehow unaffiliated with any nation or government. It's that he's a James Bond villain. He's only in it for himself. I think he is put in that position so that to enable him to take the blame for many operations that are conducted by sovereign governments.
That sounds a bit like maybe a little elements of Klaus Schwab gets the same treatment as well.
Yes, absolutely. I believe Klaus Schwab is exactly the same sort of creature as George Soros, and plays exactly the same sort of role. where he plays a James Bond villain who seemingly came out of nowhere, has no power structure behind him, but for some mysterious reason, every government in the world kowtows to him. And the thing too, another suggestion that Soros is a British operative as opposed to an American one, and those are the only really two possibilities there are. He's either working for the UK or the US. He's not working for anybody else. But another indication now is Soros has for a long time been advocating the elimination of the U.S. dollar as the global currency, and he started agitating for that back in 1987, and saying that we had to go to another currency system. So when he did that, he was clearly taking an anti-American position. Mm-hmm. And then beginning in the early 2000s, certain figures in the UK started taking that position as well. So that now all of a sudden we have this BRICS situation. We have the UK semi-officially, or maybe it's even officially at this point, getting behind the agenda of de-dollarization, of moving off the dollar standard and creating some new currency order with the so-called BRICS nations. And so this is clearly a UK agenda, which the UK is pursuing for reasons of their own, which are not yet clear to me, but it was a Soros agenda going back at least to 1987. He wrote about it in his book, The Alchemy of Finance. And so you see this on one issue after the other with Soros. It's another bit of evidence. It's not absolute proof, but it's another bit of evidence as to why I would say he's a UK asset as opposed to a US asset. And he's got to be one or the other. He can only be one or the other, because he is working at the apex of the free world power structure. And the apex of the free world power structure is the Anglo-American alliance. And everybody else is secondary. And so is he on the Anglo side or the American side? And I say he is consistently on the Anglo side, according to my analysis. Can I definitively prove that? No, I can't. But it just appears to be the case, and I made that case in my article, how the British invented George Soros, and so that's my story, and I'm sticking with it.
Well, one of the things I find interesting is that all of my research looks at these like big thinkers, like who hang around with these people like Klaus Schwab and the like Herman Kahn, and he was very clear that the current for them in like 1967 when he was writing this, the current establishment was the Anglo-American, Britain and America close together, and the winning move was to get Europe to join on their side, the whole of Europe, and then they would be able to overpower all the other major blocks with that unit that has been so successful. And after, I think, when the intelligence operations in after World War II and during World War II and after World War II led the British to start trying to get the Americans to do things by doing intelligence operations aimed at America, and America were then doing the same thing to the British, and they kept doing that backwards and forwards. I think eventually they got to a point where they were like, okay, we're on the same side, so let's put in this same amount of effort but to the same agenda, and since I would say the late 60s, early 60s onwards, there's been a very significant level of cooperation between intelligence assets in both America and Britain. It looks like that sort of hegemony is sealed in, and they're heading towards something bigger. So it makes sense then that if you're George Soros and you're from a country like Hungary, which is kind of a little bit out of course, coming out of the Soviet sphere of influence, but it is kind of in Europe, but had recently in World War II fought on the wrong side and got in, always was a little bit of a naughty boy. Hungary's positioned really well not to easily be taken and stuff. So likely to produce these people. Who are you going to go with? If you're George Soros, you've got a choice between two power blocks, haven't you? You see if you're going to go with Europe or you're going to go with America and Britain if you're working at those high level operations. Of course, I would see that Britain would be the obvious choice due to the fact that he's on the European continent. And if you're going to join with that block over there, you may as well do it with the one in the middle and where all of the power seems to emanate from, because that is really important to note that every time I'm looking into stuff, it ends up back in two places. It ends up back in the halls of Harvard and then a little bit earlier in London. So, and Oxford and Cambridge and the usual places with the usual suspects. I'm really happy to hear you talk about Jacob Rees-Mogg's father and his influence as well, because that makes a lot more sense to other things. I was investigating, well, back when I was a bit more like when I was left wing, when I believed like I was on the right side of politics. Jacob Rees-Mogg was this right-wing figure in the Conservative Party that seems so easy to poke fun of, but there must be a serious aspect to his tomfoolery and this guise he puts on as being a flippant everyman of the establishment. It reminds me very much, he has very much in his gait, in his stature, in his size, in the way he presents himself, is very much like John Kenneth Galbraith. He's a diplomatic sort, crossing boundaries on what seems like an extreme end of the spectrum. And even though John Kenneth Galbraith was on the left and Jacob Rees-Mogg is on the right, I've always found his rise extremely interesting because he's such a character. There must be something more to it. And I remember investigating, I think it was Downside Abbey, where there would been a cover-up of a priest doing things with kids. And he was heavily involved in that. And I thought, oh, that might be a place to look into. And then I realized the power he had seemed to be bigger than what I had expected. But then everything else kicked off and life takes you away and then you don't get round to it afterwards. So I may, seeing as I'm going to be centering in on a lot of British stuff at the moment, I may go back to the Rees-Mogg family and see if I can dig up anything there, because it sounds like you're in the heart of the elite. So what other subjects have you been, because you've obviously got a massive career, a long career behind you, covering all sorts of topics. I notice your books don't seem to be like one style. You dip your toes in many ponds. So what's some been, apart from like Soros and the British establishment, what have been some of your main focus of research over your career so far that has really intrigued you and really you think people really need to understand?
Well, first, let me say the wide range of subject matter of my books that you referenced has something to do with my interests to some extent, but it really has more to do with the fact that unlike many people who succeeded in becoming a full-time author, as I did for about 10 years. I in the 90s, early 2000s, really more in the 90s, I simply wrote books, and I had some pretty big bestsellers. Now, unlike most people who succeed in becoming a full-time author, I succeeded by my own wit by my own skill. I did not have family connections or any of the kinds of things that are so important in the book publishing industry. And so I had to be very practical in a way that many people don't. And in order to make an actual living doing it, I had to think very shrewdly for each time I wrote a book I had to think about who's going to buy this book, how many copies can I sell, how can it be marketed. And so this caused me to write a lot of self-help business books and books on all kinds of different, seemingly unrelated subjects. And I've been criticized for that. You know, some people have told me through the years, well, Richard, we don't know if you should write this or that book because you just seem all over the place with your subject matter. And I think that really has to do with just the practical reality of being a middle-class person who came into this very elite world of New York book publishing, in which there are a lot of people of privilege who get to write about whatever they want and don't have to think about how you make a living. And I don't want to sound as if I'm some sort of class warrior or something of the sort, but I do think that the world of New York book publishing is a very elite world, and a lot of the people in it don't even write the books whose names, when they put their names on them. And I was a person who really did the work. The books that I wrote actually had my name, and I was up against a book publishing industry that really didn't want a person like me to write books, a middle-class person who's not related to other famous literary figures or some other sort of figures. They really didn't want me to write books at all. What they wanted me to do was ghostwrite for other people, the kinds of people who are supposed to be writing books, people who belong to the right families and who have the right connections and so forth. And people like me who actually have the, let's say, mechanical skills to actually write a book are supposed to work in the shadows in the basement and not have our names on them. And I feel almost guilty I feel like I'm telling tales out of school. You have a strange influence on me, Johnny.
Yeah, I do this. I'm sorry about
that. You're making me behave like a very bad boy. You're not supposed to say these things, but really, the way it works in the book publishing world, a person like me is actually not supposed to write books and have their names on them. When I first met with a real top level literary agent in New York, I was told in no uncertain terms, you are a writer, meaning you write. Mm-hmm. You are not an author, meaning you don't get your name on the book. The names on the books are the names of people who can't write, but they have some status as a result of the fact that they're famous, they're celebrities, they're business leaders, or they're whatever, they're yoga instructors, who knows? Yeah. But the people who actually write the books are deemed to be, a sort of clerk type of person, as a person who's a technician who works in the back room and is most definitely not supposed to have their names on it.
I feel that people, I'm around to people who are trying to break that mold all the time and getting their books out there, but it's kind of hard in amongst that sort of circle of, or that culture to get independent work out with your own name on. So you can see why people would choose to do it.
Yes, and I would have done it. I was getting tempted, but and I did do a little of that. But the fact is, I just couldn't accept the idea that my lifelong dream to be an author was not to be because I can write. Because, that was literally what I was being told. If you can actually write, you don't get your name on the book. The people whose names are on the book are people who deserve to be there because of their status in society. And you as a writer have no status in society. You're just a technician or a servant or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I fought against it. I was very lucky to find a sort of offbeat publisher, Prima Publishing, and a very nice man named Ben Dominitz, who believed in me. And for about 10 years, I wrote for him and his smallish publishing company. But then he got swallowed up by Random House. And then Random House got swallowed up by Bertelsmann, a German company.
Oh, wow.
And my career as a best-selling author suffered once those ownership changes happened, and I'm not actually allowed to tell you why.
Ah, right. Okay.
In fact, I'm not actually allowed to tell you that I'm not allowed to tell you why. So I'm being a very bad boy.
Dave, you're doing it again. Stop it. Protect yourself. God damn it, Richard. No, it's a weird world you enter into there, isn't it? Where suddenly that propaganda of someone else is the powerful thing, and your own truth and the truth that you can find is a thing that doesn't sell unless it's wrapped in a different cloth and things are jiggled about a little bit. And it's very telling to the society we live in, because I mean, it is a post-truth era after all. And so what better way than to have books that aren't written by the people who are writing them, you know, or the people who are supposedly writing them. And I've seen this a lot in history as well, you know, when you research some of these establishment types. And at this time, they started writing a book. And in actual fact, they've got a team of people in a room writing a book. And they're going in once every now and again going, how's it going, gang? Did you get all of the bits that I suggested in there? And so you know, yeah, you see this has been going on for donkey's years. I'm pretty positive that a lot of these people have had that sort of. It's actually challenging. Well, as someone who wants to start writing books, because of course I've tackled some big subjects. I tend to write long form articles. I tend to go towards series. So by the time I've finished a series, it's like 30,000 words, and it's really condensed down into a subject. So it seems how much subject matter do you need for a good book, do you think, if I was to enter into the world of being a published author, if I managed to?
Well, I've never worked it out to a formula, but usually what I do is I write articles first, and I just start writing articles on a certain theme, and at a certain point I figure I've got enough out there to do it. And that's what I'm doing right now with these books about basically about the British. You know, I've been doing this for 2 going on 3 years. I guess I started putting them in article form. First I started doing tweets, long tweets. Then I started doing articles. But they're all on the same theme: how the British invented George Soros. I have my biggest one is 18,000 words long. It's how the British invented communism and blamed it on the Jews.
Yeah, I saw that. I'm definitely going to have to indulge in that one, because I do think that's sounds about right. To be perfectly honest, communism keeps getting reinvented all of the time, and now it's like it's parts of it are being adapted into stakeholder capitalism. So we've got a little bit there. I mean, that's what I think Klaus Schwab did really well, is joining these ideologies into one ideology, so they can have the worst bits that they love so much out of all of these different ideologies and stuff them together into something that, yeah, it looks like techno-communism, or at least communitarianism, or something along those lines. Where do you see the future going then? I mean, as you've been doing this for a long time, you've been watching the way the world turns. We're entering into obviously crazy times. I mean, we're at the end game in Israel. Where do you think the world's turning now in the next 10, 20 years?
Well, it is my thesis in this series of articles I'm writing now, soon to be a book, that we are actually still living in a world which is controlled primarily by British elites. This is actually what I'm claiming. It is my claim, rightly or wrongly, that the power transfer that supposedly occurred, let's say after World War II or during World War II, supposedly the Pax Britannica morphed into the Pax Americana. And supposedly the United States became the great empire that rules the world. I am arguing expressly against that. I think what actually happened, and I think I've already made a very strong case for it in my series of articles, is that a group, a cabal of very high-level British aristocrats and power brokers, beginning as early as the 1880s, started making very highly specific plans for reorganizing the British Empire. At that point, they realized that the United States and Russia, and to some extent Germany, were going to supplant them as the most powerful empires in the world unless they did something. They saw specifically, that is, these British imperialists, they saw that their model of empire, a maritime empire on many continents separated by water, they saw that that was not going to be militarily defensible against these land empires that were springing up, the US, Russia, and Germany, and that these land-based empires had a natural military and economic advantage because they were concentrated on a particular landmass, and they could cut the British supply lines pretty much any way they wanted. So a lot of this was based on very hard-nosed military assessments of what would happen in an all-out world war where all the great powers were involved. And the British, being the brilliant empire makers that they are, they foresaw long before anybody else did exactly what was going to happen in the 20th century, and they began planning for it, at least as early as the 1880s. And I've written about all this. And they formed a group which came to be called the Round Table Group, which was dedicated to this very problem: how to survive this trauma, how to survive what British elites clearly recognized decades in advance would be the utter destruction of their empire by the rise of these land-based competitors, the US, Russia, and Germany in particular. These land-based empires they foresaw were going to be able to destroy their sea-based empire because it was too spread out and it was not militarily defensible. So what these British imperialists decided, and most of these plans were eventually published in books and newspaper articles and what have you. It's all public. None of it is secret. It's just that people ignore this. But what they decided, and this was the famous Round Table Group, which you may be familiar with, supposedly originally formed by Cecil Rhodes, but Cecil Rhodes was only in his mid-20s when he supposedly formed it. And it was clearly not him. And one of its biggest proponents was, in fact, the heir to the throne, who became King Edward the seventh, was it? The one who succeeded Queen Victoria.
Echoes of Charles and the Great Reset.
Right. And so the Crown Prince was the leader of this movement that became the Round Table, and its whole purpose was to try to anticipate the inevitable breakup of Britain's maritime empire
Mhm.
and to figure out how to deal with the inevitable and seemingly fatal competition from these rising empires, especially the United States. So the plan that was made was to destroy the German and Russian empires, and to do so by forming an alliance with the American empire, and then to merge with the Americans into a global English-speaking empire that would rely on American military power and American wealth to act as the enforcer, but would actually be run from London.
Mhm.
And it's the part about being run from London that people don't get and that they don't believe. Because often, people will say, especially now when I bring this up on Twitter or X, as I guess we're supposed to call it now, and so often I get these British people saying, "Have you been to London lately? Do you see what's happening?
Yeah, yeah,
How can you say something
Simplistic
so?
view.
How
Simplistic.
can you imagine that Britain is ruling the world?" But the fact is, have you been to the Rio Grande lately? I mean, have you been to America lately? The same thing is happening, and it's the same people allowing it to happen. The open borders, the complete abandonment of any attempt to control our borders
It
lead
doesn't
to
even matter if it relates to like the so-called Kalergi document and like his very short piece that he talks about that. So it doesn't matter if it relates to something like that in any way. It's just happening. It's just the process of the borders breaking down, and those borders are breaking down on purpose because they're letting
yes,
them break it down, and they're
right.
letting them break down for their own reasons. So it doesn't even have to be a grand conspiracy theory. It's just, again, loads of self-interested actors at this point see that the best way is to do that so that the big guys at the top get what they want. So
Right. And the thing is, so I get in these conversations sometimes with British people, on X, and they'll say, "Well, how can you say, this is a British plot? Look at the deplorable state of our country," and so forth. And I just say, look at the deplorable state of our country. We're not doing much better, in case you haven't noticed. Yes, we're starting wars all over the world that we can't afford. We're in a hopelessly spiraling deficit that's going to utterly destroy our economy. And unless something is done, the course we're taking now, our country is going to break up into pieces. There won't be a United States. We're going to go totally broke. We're going to have a financial catastrophe leading to a political catastrophe. We already have separatist forces that are being encouraged on an international level by all the usual suspects who like to break up countries. And so I'm just, by way of saying that, I'm just saying that the plight of the British people, which is very real and which I'm very cognizant of, is a completely separate issue from the plans of the British elites, who never have cared about the British people. Never. I mean, at the very height of what we think was the British Empire, look what Charles Dickens was writing about. He was writing about what's going on actually on the streets. And it's
yeah.
no different today. What happens on the streets is no concern of theirs. That's no concern of the Rees-Moggs and
A really,
all these people.
really interesting point. The establishment plan, the idea of getting rid of a lot of the ne'er-do-wells on the street. A point, I can't remember who it was put that Charles Dickens wouldn't exist if they had gone through a eugenics program in Britain, because his father was seen as not fit, really, basically mentally fit. So it's very likely that they wouldn't have had certain parts of the history. I just thought I'd interject with that.
Right. And now the thing is, it is very clear. There are certain books you can read. I've got to put together a book list for people, but you can read books, and many of them you can download for free from Google Books and other places on the internet. and you can read these old books, and they just lay out what the plan, the great debate that was going on in the 1880s, the 1890s, the 1900s, of all of these imperial federalists, they called themselves. They were people in Great Britain who were trying to figure out how to preserve British power in the new world that they knew was coming. And they had the foresight to know that it was coming before anybody else did. And so they formulated this plan that everything depended on bringing the United States back into the fold. Yes, they had to work with all the English-speaking peoples. They had to reorganize the Commonwealth. They had to give to some of these Commonwealth realms, as they were called, like Canada and Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. The English-speaking Commonwealth realms, they were especially important. They had to find some formula that would satisfy them so that they would all come to the aid of Great Britain in World War I. They were planning World War I more than a decade in advance. Mm-hmm. And this is something that becomes clear when you read these books, which were freely published in public. Mm-hmm. And there's no question they were planning it. They knew that they had to take down Germany, and they knew they had to take down Russia, even though Russia was their quote-unquote ally during World War I.
Do you think technological advances was the impetus, like it was really probably with World War II as well?
Well, of course, technological advances are an extremely important driver of geopolitics. Every country, every government and polity has to adapt to advances in technology because they affect trade flows, but especially because they affect weaponry and military strategy, which in the 20th century, of course, exploded into an almost science fiction level.
World War I was everything from early flamethrowers, all of the types of machine guns you could possibly, people just walking into machine gun fire, and chemical warfare galore.
Right. But the thing that was clear from the beginning, and it's fascinating, especially as an American, to read some of these British writings, because they just talk on and on about how can we bring the Americans back into the fold. And it's as an American, you kind of feel like you're listening at the keyhole to the grown-ups making plans for you. And everything that they planned to do happened because they planned well in advance to start World War I. This plan was already very much in the works by 1901. By 1909, they were switching into high gear. They were making actual agreements and treaties with all the English-speaking countries, trying to figure out what they wanted in return for participating in what would become World War I. Mm-hmm. And the United States, of course, was the biggest problem because we were not part of the Commonwealth. We were not any longer a British possession. But nonetheless, the British felt very confident that they could manipulate us because they had invented us. We were a British invention. They had created us, they had ruled us, and they had always manipulated us. And this is the secret history that I and others have been trying to bring back, which Americans don't learn about in school, is the secret history of just how much England has been involved in our affairs ever since the Revolution. We tend to think, well, we fought the Revolution, then we were independent, and we didn't have to worry about the British anymore. Oh, yes, we had another war with them in 1812, but that was resolved too. And that was the end of it. So that's kind of what you get if you go to school in America. Yes, we had a little trouble with Britain. They didn't want to give us independence. And yes, then they invaded us and burned down the White House. But that was all settled, and then it was over. That's completely not what happened. What actually happened, and here I'm not talking about offbeat theories or conspiracy theories. This is mainstream academic knowledge, but it's not public knowledge. It's not popularly known. You're not going to see documentaries about this on TV. You're not going to learn about it in school. Even if you're in college and you take courses in American history, you're not going to learn about much of your American history. You're not going to learn that the British Empire was unrelentingly hostile to the fledgling United States, unrelentingly hostile, and waged devastating economic warfare on us continually from the moment the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783. They were continually attacking us either through military means or non-military means, with the purpose of destroying our economy, breaking us up, and ultimately in their plans, weakening us to the point where we could be reabsorbed into their empire and into their European system. And this was a continual war. It was sometimes a hot war, sometimes a cold war, but it reached its culmination in the American Civil War. And I have written another article about that called how the British caused the American Civil War. And they absolutely did, where they basically what had happened in the Civil War is the British Empire had succeeded in reabsorbing the southern states into the empire. They had actually become part of Britain's informal empire, as it's called, which means the British were not, they didn't claim it as a colony. They didn't claim it politically. They weren't under any obligation to station troops there to defend it. But it was under their economic control because the South became under British influence, became a cotton growing monoculture. And 80% of that cotton was exported to England. 80% of it. And
it's quite amazing. One of the research, like a bit of research I did was in hatters in a place called Atherstone, people who were making hats. And before 1840 and the proper felt hat machines got introduced, it had been exclusively just making straw hats for the slave trade in America. And that had been going on for a long time. And basically there was all different parts of the British Empire that were making lots of money off selling things for the slaves to use, let alone slavery itself.
Right, and this situation it gets very confusing for many British people and even British historians to understand, because British people have been propagandized to see themselves as the great champions of emancipation, who at a certain point decided to stamp out slavery. And they did do that for their own reasons. They had their own geopolitical reasons for wanting to stamp out the global slave trade, but they made no effort whatsoever to stamp out slavery in the United States because they were literally investors in the slave system in the United States. It was that system which enabled the American cotton, which was the highest quality cotton in the world, to be harvested and produced so cheaply so the British could then buy it cheaply. And this was the basis of the great British textile industry, which was their dominant industry.
Again, still even up until like this 60s, 70s, 80s, textile industry. Again, loads of really interesting, like Eckhart von Königsberg, who went to school with people like Duke of Edinburgh and other people. His granddaughter is Laura Königsberg, who was the head of political editor for the BBC. But he was his son was also textile factory in Peru, I believe it was. And when the laws changed in the 70s or 80s to give him workers' rights, he got special exemption that his factory was the only factory in the country that didn't have to abide by those legislation. You know, they've got an extreme amount of power, and they just seem to be there on sitting in a factory making textiles, of course, like the old-fashioned British do.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, see, the thing is, what I wrote about in my article is the extraordinary extent to which the British actually caused the American Civil War. They planned it, they caused it, they essentially created the Confederacy. They as early as 1827, I think there was there was a man whose name now escapes me, but he was a British agent, a British covert operator who came from Manchester. Gosh, I can't remember his name, but he was first sent. He graduated from Oxford. He was recruited into British intelligence. He was first sent to France, where he helped to whip up the French Revolution. And in this same article, I describe how essentially one revolution led to the other. The British secret services co-opted the French Revolution and turned it their way, which is a very interesting story. And this man, whose name I can't remember, he was instrumental in it. Then he went to the United States. He went to, I think, South Carolina. He became a very prominent person. And I just said the year, I think it was 1826, he suddenly got up and said, this just isn't working anymore, this American experiment. You know, we Southerners, he said in his British accent, his Oxford accent, he said, we Southerners just can't get along with those Northerners. We should just break up the country, and they go their way, we go our way. And so this actually became, and it's known in American history as the speech that launched Southern secessionism. And it was made by this British spy, this British covert operator who had previously helped whip up the French Revolution. So what happened was, you can see the involvement of the British Secret Services from that moment on, instigating and building up the whole Confederate movement, the whole idea of the South having a sense of itself as a separate nation, but most especially driving the move for Southern independence was their economic dependence on Great Britain. And in the 1850s, a very famous book was written called Cotton, I think it was called Cotton is King. And it was written by a man named Christie, a Southerner. But basically what was happening at that time in the 1850s is that the North was trying to put a lot of pressure on the South to say, look, why don't you start trading with us, your neighbors in the North, and helping us build up our textile industry when we can trade internally instead of sending all your cotton overseas to help all those foreigners in Britain. And so this man, Christie, he wrote this book, Cotton is King, to basically answer these people in the North and to say, we have no interest in doing business with you Yankees up there in the North because you don't have the markets and you don't have the money to buy all our cotton. You can't afford to buy all of our cotton. And even if you could, you don't have the markets to market it globally, and the British do. And so it is not worth our while to do business with you. We are always going to do business with the British. And, you know, you can get lost, you Yankees. And this book really became it became the casus belli. It became the spark that actually ignited the war. Because when this man Christie wrote that book, and it came out in several editions, he was basically saying, we don't want you Northerners anymore. We don't need you. We have the English, and they're taking very good care of us. They're making us rich, and we don't need you. So that's how the war actually started, because the Civil War, because the more the South resisted these entreaties from the North to try to work out some economic arrangement where they could help each other, the more belligerent the North became. They tried to slap on they did slap on tariffs to make it difficult or impossible for the South to carry on their cotton trade with England. And very soon after, the whole thing exploded in war. And the British encouraged that war. They armed the South. They built ships for them. They put thousands of British troops in Canada in preparation to invade the northern states. And they worked with the French under Napoleon III. They landed an army in Mexico, which took over the country, installed the Emperor Maximilian, who was an Austrian prince. And the whole reason for doing this was that the British and the French regime of Napoleon III, which was actually a client regime of Britain, the British had installed Napoleon III in France, so he was really working for them. So between the British and their French clients, they put troops on the ground, a very large French army in Mexico, a somewhat smaller British army in Canada. They put them there just in case, but their actual plan wasn't to invade the US. What they planned to do at a critical moment, they were waiting for the South to win a decisive battlefield victory. Then they were going to give an ultimatum to the North and enforce a naval blockade that would totally destroy the northern economy, the northern will, and would have ended the war very shortly. They were right about to do that, and it surely would have worked. The only thing that saved us, by us speaking as a New Yorker, as a Yankee, the only thing that saved us, that saved the Union, was the intervention of Imperial Russia, because Lincoln had reached out to the Tsar Alexander II, and he had his own reasons to want to thwart the British and the French because they were causing him a lot of trouble in his part of the world. And so in 1863, I think it was late in the year, in the fall, Tsar Alexander II moved the entire Russian fleet to North America. He put one half of the fleet in New York, the other half in San Francisco. And although the Russian fleet, of course, could not have stood up to the British fleet, and especially the combined French and British fleets, they didn't want to go there. They didn't want to start a world war. And so the Tsar basically put his entire navy in the way of the French and British fleets, and it was a standoff. It was calling their bluff. And the Russians were there for many months, I think as long as a year, and finally the British and the French backed down, and the Battle of Gettysburg was won. The war turned in the Union's favor, and we really owed that victory almost entirely to that Russian intervention. And I tell this whole story in my article, and I can tell you, Johnny, growing up as an American and learning American history in school, we never heard a word of this. We never heard a word about this Russian intervention, not a word, nor did we hear about the hostility of the English and the French and how they were backing up the Confederacy. This has been wiped from our history, wiped from our history books. So I and some other people have been slowly trying to bring back this forgotten story. And it's just an illustration of what's really been going on behind the facade of fake history, where we supposedly fought a revolution And then we fought the War of 1812, and then there was no more trouble with England. And then 100 years later, we're the best of friends, and we're all marching off to war to beat the Huns in World War I. It didn't happen like that. We had nothing but trouble with England all through the 19th century. There was continual hostility on many levels, and especially in terms of economic warfare, because the Bank of England really controlled our economy. And if you look at even mainstream historians, they will admit that the US economy was essentially controlled by the Bank of England right up through the 1850s. And some historians will even say that was the case right up to World War I. So there's so much hidden history that we don't understand. Yeah. And most of this history has to do with underestimating the power of Great Britain and the power of the British Empire and the power of the City of London and its financiers to push the United States around. This has been systematically underestimated to make it seem as if the US was somehow living in some blessed state where we were in our own world and completely unafraid and unthreatened by anything happening in the old world, when in fact we were always in a continual war with England, either hot war or cold war. And the war was about control. The war was about the fact that the British never accepted our independence. They did not accept the outcome of the War of Independence. They were never reconciled to it. But they also knew, because of their own experience, of their own centuries of experience, they knew there were many different ways to control other countries, aside from direct colonization or military occupation, that there were many ways to do it through banking and through managing the trade balance and so forth and so on. And so the British always understood that American independence was something that mainly existed on paper, that there were all kinds of ways of managing that independence and recolonizing parts of the US as they did with the cotton growing South, or simply financially exploiting other parts of the country in various different ways. There's a whole fascinating history of how the British financial interests managed this relationship with the United States throughout the 19th century. And then finally came the 20th century, and that's when this roundtable movement came up. That's when the British said to themselves, it's all been a lot of fun, playing cat and mouse with the Americans, but now we have to resolve this problem completely. And we can no longer afford to play games with the United States, because now we have Russia, which is rapidly industrializing. We have Germany, which is rapidly industrializing and building a great naval fleet and merchant fleet. And so something must be done. And so this is when the plans for World War I were being made. And the key to that plan was to reach out to the United States and make a military alliance with us and bring us into the war on the side of the British for the very first time since the Revolution and the War of 1812, that we would finally be allies of the British instead of adversaries. And this plan worked. The plan worked. And the way it worked was the British installed Woodrow Wilson. And through Woodrow Wilson was controlled by a British agent. His name was Colonel Edward House. And when I say he was a British agent, he was actually an American, but he was a Southern American from Texas. His father was an Englishman. His mother and father came from England, settled in Texas before the Civil War, and became very active in blockade running during the Civil War. They had a fleet of merchant ships running back and forth to England with supplies of cotton, trading them for munitions and so forth. So his father was a British agent, and he became a British agent. He and all his brothers were sent to England to boarding schools, even though they were born in America. And they were inculcated from birth with the idea that their first loyalty was to England. Yeah. And so this man,
that's an Englishman. That's an Englishman.
Right, yes. And
I know, as a Welshman, I know. Right. We got 500 years of occupation behind us so far.
Right. Well, I know. Mm-hmm. And the thing is what you said is correct. That's an Englishman. And this Colonel House was an Englishman, even though he was born in Texas. He was totally English. He was raised English. He was indoctrinated English. And so he became the closest advisor to Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson was a Confederate. He had been a young man, 12, 13 years old, maybe as old as 14, when the South surrendered. But he had lived in, I forget what state, maybe South Carolina, possibly. But he had been a Confederate. He was brought up as a Confederate, and his whole administration were Confederates or ex-Confederates or children of Confederates. And the Confederates still remembered that the British had been their supporters and their allies in the Civil War, and they still felt a loyalty towards them. So this Colonel House was a British agent, and he was planted right next to Woodrow Wilson and absolutely controlled him. He had a Svengali-like control over him. And this man House, we have all his letters, collected letters that he sent to high officials in London, constantly reporting on his progress in manipulating Woodrow Wilson. He formed a relationship with a man named, what was his name? I can't remember his name. He was the British, what was his position? He had a diplomatic position. He was the British attaché or something like that for North America, or at least for the United States. Mm-hmm. And his name was Wiseman. Was it William Wiseman? Something like that. So this man Wiseman lived in the same apartment building as Colonel House. There are some rumors that there may have been a sexual relationship between them. There was a very close friendship in any case. And eventually, and this man Wiseman was the head of British intelligence in America. So it was extremely improper for this close advisor to President Wilson to be in the same apartment house and having this very close personal relationship, which may have been even more than personal. And the whole thing was improper, but then Colonel House brought this man, Wiseman, he introduced him to the president, and they all became a group together. They even went vacationing together. They took fishing vacations together, causing jealousy amongst others in Wilson's cabinet. So basically, between this British spy master Wiseman and his recruit, Colonel House, Wilson was more or less completely under the control of British intelligence, and apparently had no objection to that. Yeah. And under their supervision, he set up the Federal Reserve System.
Oh, wow.
And under their supervision, he brought the U.S. into World War I to help Britain. And under their supervision, Wilson actually traveled to Europe to take part in the Versailles treaty negotiations with Wiseman and Colonel House at his side, trying to control him. And what happened, to make a long story short, is that the U.S. Senate completely rejected the Versailles Treaty. The interesting thing is, too, that a myth was created that somehow Woodrow Wilson was this great idealist who wanted to set up the League of Nations. It's a complete lie. The League of Nations was a British idea, in which the British had been formulating and pushing since the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And they started pushing it very hard at the outset of World War I. In fact, H.G. Wells, who was a British intelligence operative at the time, a very high-level one, he wrote a book called The War to End War, something like that. And he wrote it within days of the outbreak of World War I, where he basically laid out the plan and said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to set up a peace league after the war. We're going to bring the United States into it. We're going to do this, that, and the other. And everything happened just as he said in this book.
Yeah. I know he was pretty powerful. Yeah.
Right. And so all of this had been planned by British intelligence in great detail, and they somehow installed Woodrow Wilson, knowing his personal weaknesses of character. Perhaps they had blackmail material on him, who knows. But he was a very unlikely person to be president. He was a university president, and so he was escalated very rapidly into the presidency, where he immediately came under the control of British intelligence. And all this is indisputable, even though they don't teach it to us in school this way. Once you start looking at the primary sources and all that, it's absolutely indisputable. Now, the thing that's temporarily stopped this British plan is the U.S. Senate, because the U.S. cannot make any foreign treaty without the ratification of the U.S. Senate. So after Wilson came up with his 14 points and all his plans for forming this permanent alliance and global government and League of Nations in cahoots with the British Empire, he had the inconvenience of having to present it to the American people in the form of the U.S. Senate. And the U.S. Senate just threw it out. And this was right. And this was largely because of the very large population of Irish Americans in the United States, who were possibly the most powerful interest group in the U.S. at that time. Some would argue they still are.
It's very interesting what you're saying there, because I know that later I've talked about in my Black Hand series, in the fifth part, I talk about Ivor Bryce, who was a member of the OSS and later on helped write James Bond with Ian Fleming and helped create that mythos, and was, of course, an intelligence agent, and whose job was to try at one point. He set up a guy being found. He was actually a Welshman who was dressed up as a German pilot. He had already died, but they had faked a crash and put his body in the water with a suitcase attached to it with a handcuff and fake maps of Cuba in it, just off the coast of Spain. So that when they dragged him in, it got back to the Americans eventually. They were based there, that the British, the Nazis were planning to put bases on Cuba. And that plan wouldn't be very good, except, just to trick people or go into a paper. But it wasn't for that. It was specifically so that when it got to the Senate stage, that the Senate would change their whole approach to Cuba, and would change the national approach to Cuba, which suddenly became more hostile and it hadn't been beforehand, but was, of course, influenced by British intelligence, who were pushing, always pushing, and obviously the Senate is that very important. Listen, we've been going for over 2 hours now, so I'm aware that people at home have got a lot to take in, because there's a lot to take in. Where do you think the British stand today? As we close up, where do you think the British stand? Do you think they still stand as they still have significant enough control over American politics and American society and American culture that means that they still are ruling the roost?
I think they do, and the reason I believe it is simply because I know I've studied how the British Empire has operated through the ages. And a lot of people don't understand this. They say, well, look at England, look at the British Isles. It's so small and America is so big. Well, Brazil is big too, and Russia's big, but that's not really the issue. Bigness. Being big just means you have a lot of room and you have a lot of natural resources to be exploited. That's not what causes you to be powerful. British power lies very specifically in their strategy of playing off one country against another, of triangulation. And what they have typically done throughout the entire history of the British Empire is they'll go to one country and say, that other country, they'll go to country A and say, looks like country B is getting too strong. Let's you and I team up and let's humble country B so they won't be so much of a threat. And then they'll go to war, they'll beat up country B. Then the British will sidle over to country B and say, oh, you poor country B, look what country A did to you. Let's build you up, and then we'll go after country B. And it sounds kind of ridiculous, but this is the actual game of balance of power that the British, they didn't invent it. I mean, the Romans did the same thing. Every great empire has done the same thing, but the British raised it to a science, and they brought it into the modern world, and they're still doing it today. And so that's why England doesn't need to be a large populous country with great resources, because what they do is they play off large countries against each other in this game of balance of power, in this game of triangulation. And so I think the British are still doing that today. It's very clear that they're doing it, because now we have certain people in the British government saying, let's basically destroy the United States economy by getting off the dollar and joining with all these other countries, the BRICS countries, to create a new currency that will, including Russia, China, and all these others. And Great Britain has been openly working towards this end since the beginning of the 2000s, at least. And America has been strangely in a daze over this, not opposing it as strongly as you would think. But it's going to cause an absolute catastrophe in our country if they succeed in doing that. And I understand, yes, there are problems with the dollar, but the way they're going to do it has clearly been calculated to cause a tremendous catastrophe and breakdown in the U.S., and probably a physical breakup of the U.S. into different parts, which has been a British policy goal ever since the Revolution. The British have always wanted to break up the United States into smaller pieces so they can play the same game of triangulation, of playing one against the other, and not have to be faced with this great united behemoth, which could potentially turn against them. So what I see, to answer your question, is the same British policy today that we've had for the last 250 years or more, a policy of divide and conquer, divide and rule, and a policy of playing off one country against the other. We have seen the British play, we didn't get to talk about the British role in building up China into a superpower at odds with the United States. And Lord William Rees-Mogg, in fact, and George Soros were very much involved in building up China back in the 80s.
We can definitely do an entire podcast about that sometime. I wouldn't mind that, that's for sure.
Right, and there's no question, and there are quotes by Rees-Mogg, I've blogged on this quite a bit, where he expressly says the whole purpose of this is to replace the power of the United States with the power of China. And this is our ally talking. So why would our ally want to replace us? Well, because this is how This is the British secret. The secret of the British imperium is to play off one country against another, to go in there and make deals with larger countries and keep them constantly fighting each other, with the British playing the middleman, and then somehow ending up as the negotiator who makes the
the
deal,
broker.
the honest broker. And the ultimate beneficiaries of all this, of course, are not the British people, but a very small people, the British elites, and of course their relatives in many cases, and their allies in America and in all the major countries of the world, who are working with them, often because they're blood relations of them, or their elites who have been compromised by them and who are making money off of these imperial machinations. So the British, it looks to me, are simply playing the same game that they have always done. And so I'm sorry I said this so long-windedly, but it seems to me there are only two possibilities. One is that the British will win. They'll get exactly what they want. They will split the United States into several pieces. They will ally themselves with China and God knows who else in some coalition to accomplish this humbling of America, which they want very much, moving off the dollar standard into some other standard, and somehow Great Britain, or at least the British upper crust, the elites who are planning all this, will come out smelling like a rose, and even seeming to be innocent of all of it. The villains will be other countries whom they used. So that's one possibility, which is British victory. The other possibility would have to be a complete change in the world order, in which we finally end the Pax Britannica, which I think we're still in the phase of it, and we create a real Pax Americana. We're supposedly in the final stages of the Pax Americana, but I don't believe we actually ever had such a thing. I think instead what happened is that the plan of the round tables that they had back in the early 19th century took place, where America didn't become the leading power in the world. We simply became the leading physical power within this British system, which was used to fight the wars and to expend our blood and treasure, to the point where we're now on the verge of catastrophic bankruptcy and utter destruction, and possibly the breakup of our country into several pieces, which has been a British agenda since the beginning, since the revolution.
Yep. That's it. It looks like you've built a fantastic case. And again, there's so much to explore. You and I do the same. So I'm a little bit behind. I've only had 7-8 years doing this sort of research and this sort of work. But I can't see myself doing anything different in the future. It's really interesting to dive through history, and what you discover is a history that has been written for everybody else, and underneath there's this real layer of personalities who come in and are welcomed by the establishment for being the personalities that fits the purpose at the time, and they send them out to do their bidding. And it is true, you can definitely see that the British hand in every single operation around the world. You know, they are some of the most powerful. I mean, I'm a Welshman, so we class ourselves different than the English and whatnot. We don't see ourselves as attached to the royal family and stuff, but we've been in this situation for a long time, and to be British gives us special rights around the world. You know, the British and American passports are sought after for a good reason. You know, they're extremely useful, and especially what I was talking about. I don't know if we talked about it on camera or not, but it's about embassies, and how British and American embassies have been hotbeds for intelligence for the past, well, since the creation, since before embassies were created and they just had normal diplomatic sort of missions from missionaries out there, you know. Listen, your research is fantastic, and I take it you're at richardpoe.com, yeah? Is there anywhere
Yes.
else where people can find your work? Is there anything that you'd suggest?
Well, probably the best place to see my series of articles is on Substack. I'm there. I'm on Twitter. My handle is at Real Richard Poe. And as you mentioned, I have a website, richardpoe.com. And my books are on Amazon.
Yeah.
Probably the most relevant is The Shadow Party that you mentioned, which I co-wrote with David Horowitz, and which talks about George Soros. And I guess that's it.
Well, I'm definitely going to delve into some of that because I'm going to have to. Otherwise, I won't know the players for the next part of this game that I'm playing here. Thank you so much for coming on the NEWSPASTE Podcast, Richard. It's a real great pleasure to make the acquaintance properly, and thanks for all your work.
Thank you, Johnny.